Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. And great news, Parliament is back in session. MPs are all back in Ottawa right now, and we're all ready to rock and roll. The game is afoot, as Sherlock Holmes used to say, and there's a lot of anticipation about this. So what can we expect from this session of Parliament? Some of the things is pretty obvious, I guess. First of all, the Carney government will try to continue with the agenda that they started to put forward just before the summer break. And paramount among that, of course, is the major projects bill, which passed with conservative support, by the way. Let's not forget that. And a number of projects that we're going to talk about in just a little while. You know, they got the prize, and Carney, of course, has been pretty active over the summer, notwithstanding what Pierre Poilievre has said about it. They, of course, have Poilievre back. He finally won a by-election and got his seat back, and he'll be leading the opposition. And way in the back corner on the opposition side will be a little handful of NDP MPs trying to figure out just who they are and what they are. You got to feel a little sorry, maybe just a little sorry for the NDP. I mean, you know, these people have no idea exactly what's going on. They didn't even get a participation ribbon for the last election. I mean, Carney won the top prize, Poilievre lost his seat, and the NDP were almost wiped out totally. And they've got a lot on their plate. Forget about what's happening in Parliament and across the country right now. The NDP got to figure out just who they are, but we'll talk more about that in future podcasts. They haven't even got a leader right now, of course, so that's going to be one of the discussions. But let's circle back and talk about what's going to be happening in there. I mentioned about the major projects bill, and we'll get into that in a second. One of the things I am not looking forward to, of course, is question period. That's supposed to be when the government is being held to account by the opposition parties. And if you watched the British Parliament, for instance, on the parliamentary channel here in Canada, I'm not riveted to that channel all the time, but there's some interesting stuff on there, some Supreme Court decisions and things of this nature. They show, and I forget when it's on now, the British Parliament and their question period. And there's a certain sense of civility to that. First of all, the Prime Minister has to answer every question. They can't simply deflect to somebody else. And there isn't the usual haranguing and throwing of paper airplanes and everything else. I mean, the Canadian question period, the Canadian Parliament question period is like a bunch of preschoolers on a sugar high. I mean, they're bouncing all over the place, yelling and screaming out of court, name calling. It's really unfortunate. And time after time, governments and House speakers have said, well, we're going to get that. We're going to fix that. They never do. But so there's going to be more of the same, I suppose, with that's going on, especially with Poilievre on the other side right now with his missives of misinformation. Trying to catch the government offhand, and I think people are getting a little tired of that. And I think that was one of the messages that the Canadian voters gave to Poilievre during that last federal election. And clearly, he hasn't received that one yet. But let's talk a little bit about how this government's going to move forward. The budget that we talked about back in the springtime is going to be presented in October. So there's going to be a few weeks of time, but they're not going to be sitting on their hands. There are things that need to be discussed and move forward. And just last week, of course, Prime Minister Carney announced the first 5 projects in this major projects bill, and we're going to go into detail in the next podcast that we do, as a matter of fact, and give you the pros and cons on some of those things. But it's important to move that legislation forward because there are some challenges, that's obvious, with what's going on these days in the world, the tariff situation, trade deals, and the Prime Minister's been busy, of course, over in Europe and Mexico, talking to the Mexican president just a couple of days ago, and a number of meetings he's also had with Asian nations to try to build up trade surpluses if we can, but certainly to divest ourselves of the dependency that we seem to have on the United States. And that's the wild card. We can't predict what the States is going to do. We can't predict what Donald Trump is going to do. Nobody can. So the best advice, of course, that we've always talked about here on the podcast is our government's just going to have to make their own way here and do their own thing and try to ease that dependency that we've got. And it's not going to happen overnight. I know it's cool for a guy like Poilievre to simply say, well, they haven't done anything. You can't turn the ship around that quickly. There's a generational thing that has gone on here. And it's not just under the last government. The Harper government was guilty of this, the Martin government, the Chrétien government, the Mulroney government before that. We just always figured, well, the Americans are going to be our besties and it's always going to be fine. Well, that came crashing down, didn't it, with Donald Trump? So now we've got to find a better way. And the Prime Minister has mapped out a strategy for that. And those projects are going to be part of this. And of course, the budget will be another part of it. And that is going to be a big part. And again, there's some, I think, some misinformation and maybe some honest misunderstanding about what Prime Minister Carney has talked about here. When he has been asked about the budget, when he's made himself available to the media, which is all the time, by the way, he's always wanted to step in front and answer a few questions. He talked about austerity, but investment at the same time. And some of the journalists, I don't know if they're simply trying to create headlines or they just don't get it, say, well, how can you have both? Well, you're supposed to have both. Let me put it that way, okay? The whole idea, first of all, about austerity and investment. Investment is spending money that you know you're going to get a return on. In other words, there's going to be an end game to this. And we found in politics, when I was doing municipal politics, your budget's basically broken down into two things. There's capital and there's operational. Capital are the big projects, and that's what the Prime Minister's talked about over the last couple of months now, is building big things. Ports, seaway improvements, rail lines, whatever it takes. Pipelines is part of that discussion, too. Those are capital projects, and that's what he means by investment. In other words, it's not money that's just going to pay for that, and then it's just going to sit there. It's going to make money for us as Canadians, and it's going to put us back on our financial feet and a solid ground. That's important, and Canadian governments of the past have not always done a very good job of investing and spending the money wisely so that there is going to be an economic return. The Prime Minister has already told us what he wants to do, and as we mentioned, when that bill came before the House just before the summer break, it got support from the Conservative government. Now, maybe one of the reasons it got support was because Poilievre wasn't in the House then. He had lost his seat, of course. Andrew Scheer was leading the government in Parliament, and he supported it, and so did his caucus. And you may remember that when the day that the bill actually passed in Parliament, Carney went across and shook Scheer's hand and said, thank you for the support. This is what we need. And I know that on a theoretical basis, we'd like to think that there can be bipartisan support for things that are going to be good for the country. There's always going to be political snipping and snapping about this, that, and the other thing. That's politics. We get that. But sometimes you got to lay that down and simply say, okay, we've got to be on the same team here. And I think Carney tried to get people in that mindset, of course, when he started talking about the tariffs and the elbows up. And most people bought into it, and including some of the Conservative and NDP people, because we saw that there was a positive end to this. And, it's a work in progress, certainly. But as we've talked about in past podcasts, it's not for lack of trying at this end. It's simply because of the crazy man in the White House down there is next to impossible to deal with. But that doesn't mean we have to stop. And Carney has committed to doing those sorts of things. And we'd like to think in this session of Parliament that sense of cooperation, that sense of putting country instead of politics is going to prevail. I don't know that it is. And I'm not really optimistic about that, and that's personally because of Poilievre. He just doesn't seem to get it. He just always seems to think that his idea is to simply oppose everything. I mean, if they passed a motion this week that said Christmas is going to be December 25th this year, I got the sense Poilievre would probably vote against it simply because it was a liberal initiative, a liberal bill. And that's so small-minded politics, and it's holding us back. And, if that's the guy that the Conservatives want as leader, well, that's their business. But, you will suffer the consequences of that in time. Let's not forget the polls that have been done on this. Canadians just don't seem to like this guy. And there was an expectation, maybe a hope, that with this new session, and since this guy finally won a by-election in Alberta, that maybe he'd learn from that. And not necessarily be passive, you don't want that, but at least understand that there has to be some sense of reaching across the aisle from time to time. Judging from the comments we've heard from Poilievre since he's won that by-election, I don't think that's going to happen. And that's unfortunate because it's going to be a problem to try to get some of these things done. But it's really a very important session to get going here, because we need to understand exactly what we need to do, which is basically we've got to get Canada back, okay, economically. All the other things that we've talked about here, cost of living, cost of housing, things of that nature, they're all tied to obviously economics. And a lot of that economics is tied to tariffs. A lot of the cost of living and the things that have gone up, groceries and things of this nature, have been because of U.S. policies and Canadian policies that have been affected by that. And that's the problem. And, we can bang on the door and say we need some help from the United States, so we need some relief. I don't know that we can count on that fact that that's ever going to be there. I know there are a lot of people who are sympathetic in the U.S. government to what's happening here, not just in Canada, but in other countries. But nothing's going to change anytime soon. So the Prime Minister has been quite clear about that this is not just a little blip. People are going to hurt. And he told us that 6 months ago, that look at for what we need to do and where we are right now, there's going to be some pain. And I'm sure we're going to see some of that when the budget is produced in a few weeks' time here, too. Austerity, that could mean job cuts. It could be a number of different things. But at the same time, you don't just hang the we're out to lunch sign out. We have to invest and we have to create economic prosperity in other areas. It's a difficult balance and it's a delicate balance. But right now, it seems as if the Canadian people are on side with that. Why do I say that? Well, I just seem to happen to have another poll in front of me. Political polls are, as we have described, snapshots in time. And this is a very important time. And here's a snapshot for you that just came out from the folks at Ipsos. And Daryl Burker, of course, who's been a guest on our radio show many, many times, a smart guy and has an uncanny ability to be able to put his finger on the pulse of the Canadian people. Well, the poll that they just released, and this is on the eve of Parliament going back to work, says that this government, the Carney government, when they go back to work in this session of Parliament, has an approval rating among Canadians that no government has seen for nearly 10 years. The highest it's been in over 10 years. And yes, I know these are rough times that we're having right now, but this blatantly says Canadians have this guy, they've got your back, and they believe what's going on here. As a matter of fact, and I know Poilievre has said, well, it's a do-nothing government. They didn't do anything at all in the summer. Well, Canadians tend to disagree with that, Mr. Poilievre. Over the summer, the Carney government approval rating actually climbed by 10 points. I know people were saying, well, because of the tough economic times, it's going to start to erode. It climbed. It's 10 points higher than it was at the beginning of the summer. Sits at 58% right now. And that, by the way, is the highest in over 10 years for any government. People are liking what they're seeing. And now they're not saying, hey, we're on easy street. Everything's done now. Happy days are here again. We don't have to worry about anything, Trump's or Poilievre or tariffs or anything else. No, we know there's a lot of work to be done. But the most important element, I think, for us to be successful in this endeavor is you got to have faith in the people making the decisions. You have to, if you don't believe in the captain or the coach, it's going to be pretty difficult to follow along. Well, Canadians are still believing in this. Now, nobody gets a blank check in politics. And I think Mark Carney understands that. We certainly understand that. That doesn't mean that they're always going to be on side. As we talked about in the last podcast, Canadians want to see some results. And it's great to say, yes, this is a great idea. That's going to help in the long run. But what about tomorrow? What about right now? What are we going to do about some of the challenges facing us? And that means some wins. We need to see some goals in the nets. I do, since we're big on hockey metaphors these days. Put the puck in the net once or twice. That all goes towards winning in the long run, doesn't it? So that's going to have to happen. And the major projects that they talked about here, I think, are a very, very big step in that direction. And we're going to talk about that in some of the future podcasts. But looking forward to what's going to be happening and looking forward to discussing it, of course, on the podcast. And, of course, your reaction to that, as always. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Of course, if you're on YouTube watching our podcast, don't forget to hit that notification bell. And please subscribe. We're doing a lot of work here. We appreciate the feedback. It's great to get this dialogue going. We've always tried to do that here on the podcast. But subscribing really helps us to get that work done. And for folks on Blue Sky, as we mentioned in the last podcast, for some reason, we've been on Blue Sky, I think, almost from day one. Our account was suspended, and I'm trying to get some clarification as to why. They just said they thought somebody was hacking it or something, but we lost patience, quite frankly. I love Blue Sky. Don't get me wrong. Great people. But we've started another Blue Sky account right now, and it's at Bill Kelly Podcast. All right. So if you're on Blue Sky and say, where the hell's Kelly? I haven't seen him for a few weeks. Go to at Bill Kelly Podcast, and you can pick us up then. And we want to renew friendships with some of our old fans and create some new ones, too, on Blue Sky. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.